The scent of rain and rejection clung to the castle stones. Princess Isoldea stood on the balcony, a ghost in her own home, watching the shifter guards in the courtyard below. They moved with a predatory grace she could never possess, their powerful forms a constant, painful reminder of what she was not. She was human. In a kingdom of shifters, to be human was to be a flaw, a broken piece of a proud lineage. Her mother was a wolf shifter from a noble line, her father a human king whose lands were now failing. Isoldea was the disappointing result of their union, a princess without a beast within. Her older sister Thalysra had been the perfect daughter. Thalystra's shift had been glorious, her wolf form a silver shadow of immense power. She had married the alpha of a neighboring pack, securing an alliance that had briefly propped up their father's crumbling rule. But Isoldea had nothing to offer. No power, no pack, no value. She was just a reminder of a bad bargain. Her father entered the chamber behind her, his steps heavy with the weight of his crown. He did not look at her, instead staring out at the same grim view. "The council has agreed," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "The tribute is accepted." Isoldea's heart seized. Tribute, that's what she was. Not a bride, not a princess, but a piece of property to be traded. "The Wolf King? Zephyros?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "He is the most powerful alpha on the continent," her father replied, as if that explained everything, as if that erased the horror stories. Zephyros was known as the Stone King, a ruler of terrifying power and chilling cruelty. It was said he hadn't been seen in his wolf form in years, leading to dark rumors of madness, of a monstrous curse. "He has demanded a bride to seal our new treaty," her father continued, finally turning to face her. His eyes were cold, pragmatic. "You are the only one I can spare." The words were a physical blow, the only one he could spare, the unwanted one. She felt the familiar shame rise like bile in her throat. She had spent her life being overlooked, her worth measured only by her failures. Now, her final purpose was to be thrown to a monster to save a kingdom that had never wanted her. She looked down at her hands, pale and trembling. They were useless hands, human hands, and they were all she had. Later that day, a young servant boy, barely 10 years old, slipped on the wet stones of the servants' staircase, his cry of pain echoing in the narrow passage. Isoldea was passing by and rushed to his side without a thought. His ankle was already swelling, twisted at an unnatural angle, and tears streamed down his soot-stained cheeks. "It hurts," he sobbed, clutching his leg. I know," Isolde murmured, kneeling beside him. The guards would call a healer, but they were often rough and impatient with the staff. Instinct took over. She placed her hand gently over his injured ankle. A strange quiet settled over her, a deep well of calm she could sometimes access. It flowed from her, through her palm, into the boy. She felt the thrumming, sharp edges of his pain as if they were her own, a dissonant chord in the symphony of life. She didn't consciously do anything, she just soothed it. She focused on the feeling of wholeness, of peace, and pushed it towards him. The boy's frantic sobs lessened, his breathing evening out. It doesn't hurt as much now," he whispered, looking at her with wide, astonished eyes. The swelling hadn't vanished. The bone was likely still broken, but the terrible, sharp agony had receded into a dull ache. Her mother had once called it a woman's comforting touch, a dismissal that had stung. It was seen as nothing more than a gentle bedside manner, a quaint and useless trait in a world that valued claws and fangs. It wasn't magic, not in the way the pack sorcerers wielded it. There were no lights, no chants. It was just a quiet, empathetic connection, an ability to feel another's pain and offer a moment of respite. She helped the boy lean against the wall until a proper healer arrived, then slipped away before anyone could ask questions. This small power was hers alone, a secret she held close. It was a soft, gentle thing in a hard, violent world. And like her, it was considered utterly worthless. As she walked back to her chambers to pack her few belongings, she couldn't help but feel the bitter irony. The only unique gift she possessed was the ability to soothe pain, and she was being sent to a man whose greatest pleasure was said to be inflicting it. The journey to the Northern Kingdom was a silent, grim affair. Isoldea was escorted by a detachment of her father's guards, their expressions carefully neutral, though she could feel their pity. They were delivering a lamb to the slaughter. The lands grew colder, the trees taller and more menacing, the very air crackling with a wild, untamed energy she had never experienced. This was the domain of wolves. As they passed through the outer villages, the shifter folk paused to watch her carriage. Their eyes were sharp, analytical, their senses tasting the air around her. She could feel their judgment without a word being spoken. Human, weak, prey. She pulled her cloak tighter, her insignificance a crushing weight. The Wolf King's fortress was not a castle. It was a blade of dark stone thrust up from the earth, a monument to power and intimidation. It clawed at the sky, its ramparts patrolled by wolves whose size defied nature. Their howls were not songs, but warnings. Her father's guards handed her over at the gate, their duty done. They did not wish her well. They simply left. Isolde was met by a tall, stern-faced wolf shifter with silvering hair and the bearing of a general. "I am Aedric, Beta to King Zephyros," he said, his voice a low rumble. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, a flicker of something, disappointment, resignation, in their depths. "The king awaits you in the throne room." She was a tribute, a piece of a treaty, not a bride to be welcomed, but a delivery to be inspected. Aedric led her through cavernous halls of cold granite and dark wood. Banners bearing the sigil of a snarling black wolf hung from the rafters, and every guard she passed looked through her as if she were made of glass. There was no warmth here, no life, only the oppressive silence of absolute authority. The throne room doors were immense, carved from the trunks of ancient ironwood trees. They swung open without a sound, revealing a vast chamber dominated by a throne that seemed forged from shadow and ice. And on it sat the king. She had heard the stories, of course. They called him the Stone King, a man whose heart was as cold and unyielding as the mountains of his kingdom. They said he was a warrior of unparalleled ferocity who had united the northern packs through bloodshed and fear. But the whispers that followed him were darker still. It had been 5 years since anyone had seen King Zephyros in his wolf form. For an alpha king, the wolf was everything, the source of his power, his connection to the pack, the very essence of his soul. To hide it was an act of profound shame or a sign of a terrible affliction. Rumors slithered through the courts of the continent. Some said he'd been cursed by a witch, his inner beast twisted into something monstrous that he dared not unleash. Others claimed he was afflicted with a creeping madness, that the power of his alpha blood was consuming him from within. The most damning whispers suggested he was broken, his wolf gone entirely, leaving him a hollow shell of a king ruling by reputation alone. His cruelty was legendary. Dissidents vanished. Rivals were broken. He ruled with an iron fist because, the stories went, he had no other choice. Any sign of weakness would see him torn apart by the very wolves he commanded. His isolation was absolute, his court a place of rigid protocol and palpable fear. He took no queen, sired no heirs, and allowed no one close. Isolde had tried to dismiss the tales as the frightened ramblings of lesser alphas, envious of his power. But as she stood at the precipice of his throne room, the chilling silence of his fortress felt like a confirmation. This was not the home of a beloved king. It was the lair of a wounded predator, one that would lash out at anything that came too close. She clutched the travel-worn fabric of her dress, her breath catching in her throat. She was about to meet the man behind the terrifying legend. King Zephyros was larger than the stories had described. He was a creature of stark lines and brutal power, his broad shoulders filling the high-backed throne. His hair was as black as a raven's wing, and his face was all harsh angles and unforgiving planes. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a winter storm, swirling with a cold, controlled fury that seemed to burn without heat. He did not rise. He simply watched her approach, his gaze a physical weight that pressed down on her. Searching for weaknesses, she felt like an insect under his scrutiny. The power rolling off him was immense, a suffocating presence that made the air thick and hard to breathe. It demanded submission. Isolde stopped a respectful distance from the dais and forced herself into a curtsy, her movements stiff with terror. "Your Majesty!" she managed, her voice barely audible in the echoing hall. "The human princess," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly sound, stripped of all emotion. It was not a welcome. It was a statement of fact. "You are smaller than I expected." Shame and a surprising spark of anger flared within her. She was a princess, a king's daughter, yet he spoke of her as if she were livestock being appraised. She lifted her chin, meeting his icy gaze. "And you are exactly as the stories describe, Your Majesty." A flicker of something dangerous danced in his eyes. He was not used to defiance, however small. Adric, standing near the throne, shifted his weight uneasily. Zephyros leaned forward slightly, his presence intensifying. "The stories people tell in the South are for frightening children. You will learn that the reality here is far more direct." He appraised her again, a long, dismissive look. "You are here to serve a purpose. You will be a symbol of this tedious alliance. You will be silent, you will be obedient, and you will stay out of my way. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Majesty," she said, the words tasting like ash. "Good," he said, leaning back, his interest already fading. "Adric will show you to your chambers. I have no desire to see you again until the formal announcement of our union." He waved a hand in dismissal, turning his attention to a map spread on a table beside him. The audience was over. She was nothing to him, a fragile human burden. The formal announcement was a week later. It was a stilted, tense ceremony in the Great Hall, attended by the highest-ranking members of Zephyros's court. Isolde was dressed in northern furs that were heavy on her shoulders, another reminder of how ill-suited she was to this land. She stood beside Zephyros, close enough to feel the chilling cold that radiated from him. He had not spoken a single word to her since her arrival. As part of the ritual, they were meant to exchange tokens. He presented her with a heavy silver necklace bearing his pack's sigil. When it was her turn, she offered a small, intricately carved box from her homeland. It was a meaningless gesture, all for show. As he reached to take it, his fingers brushed against hers. It was like being struck by lightning, a wave of agony so pure and so intense it stole her breath, flooded her senses. It was a white-hot, screaming pain that coiled and gnawed, a living thing full of desperation and rage. For a split second, she was inside his skin, feeling the torment that he lived with every single moment. It was a hell beyond imagining. She gasped, stumbling back, her eyes wide with shock. Zephyros recoiled as if burned, snatching his hand back. His control, so absolute just a moment before, shattered. For a fraction of a second, his storm-gray eyes were a vortex of raw, unguarded suffering. She saw a deep, soul-crushing weariness and a desperate plea for an end to the pain. It was the most vulnerable, most human expression she had ever seen. Then, in an instant, the mask of stone slammed back into place. His eyes went cold, his jaw tightening into a line of granite. He shot her a look of pure fury, a silent, vicious command to forget what she had just seen. The court murmured, sensing the strange tension, but no one dared comment. Zephyros finished the ceremony with clipped, brutal efficiency, his movements stiff. He did not look at her again. As soon as it was over, he turned on his heel and stalked from the hall, leaving her alone in a sea of predatory, whispering wolves. She stood trembling, the phantom echo of his pain still vibrating through her. The Stone King was not made of stone at all. He was a man being broken on a wheel of unending agony. Adric escorted her from the great hall, his expression unreadable. "Your chambers, my lady," he said, his voice carefully neutral. He led her not to a guest wing, but deep into the heart of the royal spire, to a suite of rooms adjacent to the king's own. The chambers were beautiful, a prison of breathtaking luxury. The furniture was carved from dark, polished wood, the tapestries on the wall depicted epic wolf hunts, and a fire roared in a massive stone hearth. A balcony offered a dizzying view of the jagged peaks that surrounded the fortress. It was magnificent, and it was utterly cold. "The king requires you remain in this wing of the castle," Adric stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "For your own safety. The court is not accustomed to humans." The unspoken words hung in the air. They are not accustomed to weakness. They will see you as prey. "I understand," Isolde said quietly, wrapping her arms around herself. It was not a request. It was an order of confinement. She was to be kept, like a rare, fragile doll, locked away where she could not be broken by the harsh realities of this kingdom. Or perhaps where she could not witness any more of the king's own weakness. For days, she saw no one but the silent servants who brought her meals. The loneliness was a physical ache, a hollow space in her chest that echoed the vast, empty rooms. She would stand on the balcony for hours, watching the clouds snag on the mountain peaks, feeling as trapped as they were. She could hear him sometimes, through the thick stone walls that separated her chambers from his. Not words, but sounds. The sharp scrape of a chair, the heavy tread of his boots pacing endlessly through the night, and once a low, guttural sound of frustration that was more animal than man. She was a queen in name only, a prisoner in a gilded cage. He had brought her here to be a symbol, but he had hidden her away. He wanted the world to see the alliance, but he did not want anyone, least of all her, to see the man behind the crown. The memory of the agony she'd felt in his touch haunted her. It was a secret she now shared, whether he wanted her to or not, and it made her gilded cage feel smaller and more suffocating with every passing hour. One night, a storm raged outside, mirroring the tempest she felt inside. But another sound cut through the howl of the wind, a low, pained groan from the other side of the wall. It was deeper and more visceral than anything she had heard from him before. It was the sound of a body and spirit at their breaking point. The groan intensified, rising in pitch to a guttural roar of pure, unadulterated agony. It was the sound of an animal caught in a trap, tearing at its own flesh to get free. The sound ripped through her, stirring the strange, empathetic sense within her. She could almost feel the echoes of his pain, sharp and jagged even through the stone. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was supposed to stay here, silent and obedient. To go to him would be to defy his explicit command. He would be furious. He might even harm her. Another roar, this one ending in a choked-off sob of desperation, decided for her. She could not sit here and do nothing while another living being suffered so terribly. It was not in her nature. Whatever the consequences, she had to try. Her hands trembling, she unlatched her door and slipped into the darkened corridor. The guards usually posted there were gone, likely dismissed by the king in a desperate need for privacy, or perhaps even by Aedric to spare them from witnessing their alpha's torment. The only light came from the flickering torchlight that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. She followed the terrible sounds to a set of heavy ironwood doors at the end of the hall, the king's private chambers. They were slightly ajar. Peeking through the crack, she saw Aedric standing just inside, his back to her, his shoulders slumped in helpless despair. "My king, you must let the healers try," Aedric pleaded. "Get out!" Zephyros's voice was a shredded wreck, barely human. "Leave me!" Taking a deep breath, Isolde pushed the door open and stepped inside. Aedric spun around, his eyes wide with shock and alarm. "My lady, you cannot be here!" But Isolde barely heard him. Her gaze was fixed on the figure on the floor by the fire. The king was on his hands and knees, his great body convulsing, his knuckles white as he dug his fingers into the stone floor. This was the source of the agony she had tasted. This was his secret hell. Zephyros didn't seem to notice her arrival. He was lost in his own world of pain, his body racked with violent tremors. His silken tunic was soaked with sweat, plastered to the corded muscles of his back, which were spasming uncontrollably. A low, continuous growl of agony rumbled in his chest. "Go!" Aedric hissed at her, moving to block her path. "He will not thank you for this intrusion." "Is it always like this?" Isolde asked, her voice shaking but firm, her eyes never leaving the king. Aedric's face was a grim mask of exhaustion and loyalty. "It is often worse," he admitted quietly. "Nothing helps. No healer, no poultice, no magic." Isolde looked at the mighty Alpha reduced to this state, and she felt no fear. Only a profound, aching compassion. This was not the cold, cruel monarch from the throne room. This was a man being systematically destroyed from the inside out. Ignoring Aedric's warning, she moved forward. She knelt on the cold stone beside Zephyros. He flinched at her proximity, his head snapping up. His storm-gray eyes were wild, unfocused, glazed with a feverish torment. "I told you to. Get out!" He ground out through clenched teeth. I'm not leaving you, she said softly. Before he could protest, before she could lose her nerve, she reached out and placed her hands on his trembling back. The instant her skin touched his, the full force of his pain slammed into her. It was a tidal wave, a maelstrom of sharp, tearing, burning agony. It was 1,000 times worse than the brief contact during the ceremony. It threatened to drown her, to shred her very consciousness. But this time, she was ready. She braced herself, not fighting it, but accepting it. She opened the well of calm inside herself, letting it pour from her into him. She didn't try to heal the source of the pain. She didn't know how. She simply sought to soothe the symptoms, to blanket the screaming nerve endings in a layer of peace. She felt his pain as her own, and she offered it solace. Slowly, miraculously, the violent tremors racking his body began to subside. The guttural growls softened, and the rigid tension in his muscles eased. He remained on the floor, but the frantic, desperate struggle had ceased. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the first he seemed to have taken in hours that wasn't hitched with pain. He collapsed onto his side, exhausted, his breathing still ragged but deeper. He turned his head slowly, looking at her. The wildness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a stunned, profound disbelief. For the first time in years, the pain was not a roaring inferno. It was a bed of coals, still hot, but bearable. He stared at her hands, still resting on his back as if they were instruments of some impossible magic. "How?" he rasped, the single word full of suspicion, desperation, and a fragile sliver of hope. Their secret began that night. Twice a week, when the pain became unbearable, Aedric would discreetly fetch her, and she would go to the king's chambers. She would kneel beside him and place her hands upon him, sharing his burden until the worst of the storm passed. They never spoke of it. It was a silent, desperate ritual performed in the shadows. He remained the cold, distant king in public, and she the isolated human princess. But the court was a nest of vipers, and secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. Her late-night visits, however discreet, were noticed. Whispers began to circulate. The human princess was not just a symbol. She was the king's personal pet, summoned to his chambers for his pleasure. The rumors were crude and demeaning, painting her as a human whore who had somehow bewitched their powerful alpha. The source of the most venomous whispers was Lord Caltharis, Zephyros's uncle. He was a powerfully built wolf with a cruel sneer permanently etched on his face, a traditionalist who believed strength was the only virtue. He had watched Zephyros's reign with a predatory patience, certain that his nephew's hidden weakness would eventually be his undoing. Caltharis saw Isolde as the ultimate symbol of Zephyros's decay. To take a human bride was a disgrace, a contamination of their pure bloodline. That Zephyros now seemed to favor this fragile creature was, to him, proof that the king's mind was failing along with his body. He chose his moment at a formal dinner, a gathering of the pack's highest-ranking lords and ladies. Zephyros sat at the head of the table, a remote and imposing figure. Isolde sat to his right, ignored as usual. "It is a strange alliance our king has forged," Caltharis began, his voice carrying across the hall. "One that brings us this delicate creature. Tell me, princess, what skills do you bring to the northern kingdom? Can you hunt? Can you fight? Can you bear a pure-blooded shifter heir?" The hall fell silent. Every eye turned to Isolde. Her face burned with humiliation. She had no answer. She could do none of those things. Before she could stammer a reply, Zephyros spoke, his voice like the crack of a glacier. "My uncle forgets his place." It was not a defense of her. It was a cold assertion of his own authority, but Caltheris was undeterred. "I merely ask what value she brings. Our people are strong. We have no place for weakness in the royal court. A king's mate should be his strength, not a fragile liability." The insult was clear, aimed as much at Zephyros as it was at her. Zephyros's hand tightened on the arm of his chair, his knuckles white. The air crackled with his suppressed rage. Isolde felt a tremor of his inner pain spike, and she knew the stress was aggravating his curse. Caltheris was prodding a wounded beast, and he was using her as the stick. The stress of Caltheris's public challenge triggered the worst episode Isolde had yet witnessed. That night, Aedric came for her, his face pale with urgency. "It's bad, my lady, worse than ever." She found Zephyros not just in pain, but in the throes of a horrifying transformation. He was thrashing on the floor, his body contorting. The curse, a malevolent black magic she could now sense, was fighting him, twisting him. His bones audibly cracked and reformed, his limbs elongating, his skin stretching taut over a shifting musculature. He was caught somewhere between man and beast, a grotesque mockery of a shifter's beautiful transformation. Black, vein-like lines pulsed across his skin, a visible manifestation of the poison in his soul. His eyes glowed with a feral, agonized light. This was not his wolf. This was the curse, a monster wearing his skin. He let out a roar of despair, a sound that conveyed not just physical pain, but the psychological torture of being trapped within his own body, his true form held hostage. Aedric took an involuntary step back, his hand on the hilt of his sword, his training warring with his loyalty. Any other shifter would see this as an abomination to be put down. But Isolde saw only Zephyros. She saw the proud king trapped inside the monstrous shell, fighting a battle he had been losing alone for years. Her fear was eclipsed by a fierce, protective wave of empathy. She walked forward, her steps steady, and knelt before the writhing form. "Zephyros," she said, her voice clear and calm. The creature on the floor stilled, its glowing eyes fixing on her. A low growl vibrated in its chest. "It's all right," she whispered, her heart aching for him. "I'm here." She reached out, not with hesitation, but with absolute certainty, and placed her hands on the hot, twisted flesh of his shoulder. The backlash of agony and malevolent energy was staggering. It felt like plunging her hands into a fire fed by pure hatred, but she held on. She poured every ounce of her soothing calm into him, not just dulling the pain, but confronting the dark energy itself. She pictured him as she knew he was inside, a proud, powerful alpha, his spirit a magnificent wolf of shadow and storm. She held that image in her mind and pushed it against the tide of the curse. The transformation did not fully recede, but the violent struggle ceased. The monstrous form relaxed, the feral light in his eyes dimming, replaced once more by the familiar gray of his own. He lay panting on the floor, the black veins slowly fading back beneath his skin. He was still trapped in a half-shifted state, but he was himself again. He was lucid, and he was looking at her with an expression of raw, naked vulnerability. He had shown her the absolute worst of his curse, his most profound shame, and she had not run. Caltheris grew bolder. Seeing no public reprisal for his insults, he believed Zephyros was too weak to act. He decided to remove the human distraction himself. A few days later, Isolde was taking a rare, supervised walk in the castle's inner courtyard. Adric was with her, but he was called away for a moment by a guard with an urgent message, a deliberate ploy. As soon as he was gone, 2 other guards, their loyalty clearly pledged to Caltheris, cornered her near the old well. "The king's human pet!" One of them sneered, advancing on her. "You don't belong here. It's time you had an accident." Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through Isolde. There was nowhere to run. She backed away until her back hit the cold stone of the well. In his study, miles away but intrinsically connected to her now, Zephyros felt it. A spike of pure terror, so sharp and so clearly hers that it cut through the ever-present fog of his own pain. Her fear was a scream in his soul. He didn't think. He acted. He burst from his chambers, moving faster than any human eye could follow. The guards in the hall saw only a blur of black and a gust of wind as their king, who had not been seen moving at speed in years, sprinted through the castle. He exploded into the courtyard just as the guards grabbed Isolde's arms. A roar of pure, possessive alpha fury ripped from Zephyros's throat. It was a sound of absolute command and lethal promise, a sound the court had not heard in a long, long time. It shook the very stones of the castle. The 2 guards froze, their faces draining of all color. They dropped Isolde and fell to their knees, heads bowed in terror. Zephyros didn't slow. He crossed the courtyard in 3 long strides and placed himself in front of Isolde, shielding her with his body. His storm-gray eyes burned with a cold fire that promised death. The ambient power rolling off him was staggering, pressing down on the traitors, suffocating them. This was not the pained, reclusive king. This was the Alpha of the North, in all his terrible glory. "You will not touch her," he snarled, each word a spike of ice. "She is mine. She is under my protection. Anyone who raises a hand to her answers to me." He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers over his shoulder. The fury in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second, replaced by a raw, fierce possessiveness that was both terrifying and thrilling. He had just publicly declared her his, not as a political token, but as a territory, a treasure to be defended with his life. The entire court, drawn by the roar, watched from the windows in stunned silence. The Stone King had finally shown them a crack in his armor, and it was in the shape of a human princess. Zephyros dealt with the traitorous guard swiftly and without mercy, his actions a brutal reminder to all of who was in command. Then he escorted Isolde back to her chambers himself, his hand a firm, proprietary grip on her arm. He dismissed the servants, plunging the room into an intimate silence broken only by the crackle of the fire. The adrenaline had faded, leaving them both raw and exposed. The public declaration hung in the air between them, a thing of terrifying weight. "He will not try that again," Zephyros said, his voice rough. He was pacing the room, the controlled energy of the Alpha still thrumming beneath his skin. "Why did you do that?" Isolde whispered, still shaken. "In front of everyone." He stopped and turned to face her, his expression torn. The mask was gone. In its place was the weary, tormented man she had come to know in the privacy of his suffering. "Because I could not bear the thought of them harming you." The admission was gravelly, forced from a place he kept locked away. "The curse," he began, finally giving voice to the secret that had defined his life. "It was a blood witch. During the Unification Wars, She bound my wolf, tied it to my pain. The more I suffer, the stronger the curse becomes. And the stronger it gets, the more I suffer. To force a shift, it would either kill me or unleash that thing you saw." He looked at her, his eyes full of a despair that broke her heart. "For 5 years, I have lived in this hell. 5 years of unending agony, and then you came." He took a step closer. "Your touch, it doesn't heal it, but it quiets it. It gives me silence, a moment to breathe. You are the only relief I have ever known." Tears welled in Isolde's eyes for his pain, for his loneliness. She reached out, not to heal, but simply to touch. She laid her hand against his cheek. He flinched at first, then leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as a shudder ran through him. All the pretense, all the distance between king and tribute, shattered. He was just a man, and she was just a woman, and they were two lonely souls who had found a strange solace in one another. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was born of desperation, pain, and a fierce, burgeoning hope. It was a drowning man's gasp for air, a claim, a plea, and a promise all at once. And in that moment, Isolde knew she was no longer just his healer. She was falling in love with the monster, the man, and the king. Caltheris was no fool. He had seen the look in his nephew's eyes in the courtyard. He had felt the raw power Zephyros had unleashed. The king was not weakening. He was changing, and the human girl was the catalyst. She was not a liability. She was somehow mending the king's broken parts, making him stronger. She had to be eliminated, but this time it had to be subtle. He acquired a rare poison, a distillate of wolfsbane so potent that even a few drops were lethal to a shifter. For a human, its effects were different. It wouldn't kill quickly. It would mimic a creeping, wasting sickness, a malady that would be blamed on her fragile human constitution. It was the perfect weapon. He had a loyal servant slip the clear, odorless liquid into Isolde's evening tea. She drank it without suspicion, noticing only a slightly bitter aftertaste. The effects began the next morning. It started as a deep weariness, a chill in her bones that no fire could warm. By midday, a fever had taken hold, and a sharp, stabbing pain began in her abdomen. The royal healers were summoned. They fussed over her with herbs and poultices, but they were mystified. They were experts in shifter physiology, torn muscles, broken bones, battle wounds. They knew nothing of these subtle, insidious human ailments. They pronounced her to be suffering from a frail constitution, unable to handle the harsh northern climate. Isolde grew weaker by the hour. Her skin became pale and clammy, her breathing shallow. The pain was a constant gnawing fire inside her. She was drifting, consciousness fading in and out like a weak flame in the wind. Zephyros sat by her bedside, a thunderous, helpless rage building inside him. He refused to leave her side. He watched the life slowly draining from her, and he knew, with a certainty that was cold and hard as iron, that this was no natural illness. This was an attack. This was Caltheris's handiwork. He had been so focused on protecting her from physical threats that he had not seen the assassin in the teacup. He had failed her, and the agony of her fading life was 1,000 times worse than his own curse. "There is nothing more we can do, Your Majesty," the head healer said, bowing low. "It is a human sickness. Her body is simply giving up." Zephyros dismissed him with a snarl. He looked down at Isolde's pale face, her breaths now faint, stuttering things. He could feel her life force dwindling, and it was like a part of his own soul was being extinguished. He felt her pain, a faint echo of the inferno she must be experiencing, and it fed his own curse, making the monster within him stir and claw at its cage. He knew what poison it was. He could smell the faint, acrid scent of wolfsbane clinging to her, a scent his shifter healers had missed. It was a poison for wolves, a poison he understood, and he knew there was only one way to purge it. It required the full, untainted power of a healing alpha shift, a surge of pure life force that could burn away the toxin. But his shift was corrupted. His wolf was bound. To force the transformation now, while the curse was strong and agitated by his grief, was a death sentence. It would either tear him apart from the inside, or it would unleash the twisted mockery of his wolf, a creature of pure agony that would destroy everything in its path, including her. Adric stood in the doorway, his face etched with dread. "Zephyros, you cannot," he said, reading his king's intent. "It will kill you. If she dies, I am already dead," Zephyros replied, his voice hollow. He looked at Isoldea's still form, at the woman who had walked into his hell and offered him peace. She had faced his monster without fear. How could he do any less for her? He made his choice. He would risk his life, his soul, his kingdom, all of it for her. He would rather die as a man fighting for the woman he loved than live as a king who let her perish. He knelt beside her bed, took her limp hand in his, and closed his eyes. He reached deep inside himself, past the layers of pain and rage, searching for the faint, slumbering heartbeat of his wolf. He ignored the shrieking protest of the curse and pulled. He called to his other half, demanding it answer, for the first time in 5 long years. The fight was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The moment Zephyros called upon his wolf, the curse met him with the force of a hurricane. Agony, white-hot and absolute, ripped through every cell of his body. The black veins erupted across his skin, and his bones began to crack and shift, the monstrous transformation beginning against his will. He roared, a sound of inhuman torment, as 2 opposing forces tried to tear his soul in 2. On the bed, Isoldea was roused from her feverish haze by his cry. Through the fog of her own pain, she saw him. She saw the familiar, terrible signs of the curse taking hold, but she also saw the desperate struggle in his eyes. He was doing this for her. He was trying to sacrifice himself to save her. A fierce, primal energy surged through her. It was not the gentle, soothing calm she was used to. It was a powerful, defiant love. She would not let him do this. She would not let this curse win. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she pushed herself up and reached for him, her fingers finding his arm. He was burning up, his skin a road map of pulsating dark magic. This time, she did not just soothe. She did not just share the burden. She attacked. She poured her entire being, all her empathy, all her love, all her fierce desire for him to be whole, into him. She met the malevolent, hateful energy of the curse with its polar opposite, an unconditional, selfless acceptance. She didn't just push against his pain. She embraced it, claimed it, and showed it a light it had never known. She showed it love. It was the key. The curse, a creature born of hatred and pain, could not withstand the purity of her gift. It was like dousing a flame with pure water. The dark magic recoiled, hissing and weakening. Zephyros felt the shift in the battle. He felt her strength bolstering his, her light driving back the shadows. With a final, triumphant roar, he threw his head back. the monstrous transformation halted, receded, and was replaced by something beautiful and true. Silver-black fur sprouted, his form flowing into the powerful, graceful lines of a great wolf. The shift was complete. He was whole. He stood before her, a magnificent animal, larger than any wolf she had ever seen, his eyes the same intelligent, stormy gray. He was free. He lowered his massive head to her, and with infinite gentleness, he nudged her with his nose. Then he opened his jaws and closed them carefully around her neck, his canines barely grazing her skin. It wasn't a bite to harm, but a mating claim, an alpha's most sacred bond. A surge of his own pure, uncorrupted life force flooded into her, burning the wolfsbane from her veins like a cleansing fire. The pain vanished, the fever broke, and strength flowed back into her limbs. The human princess had saved the king, and in doing so, the king had claimed his mate. The retribution for Lord Caltharis was swift and public. Zephyros, in his full glory as Alpha King with his wolf restored, confronted his uncle before the entire court. The evidence was undeniable, the traitorous guards having confessed everything. Stripped of his titles and his honor, Caltharis was exiled to the frozen wastes of the far north, a fate worse than death for a creature of the pack. With the last threat to their union neutralized, Zephyros wasted no time. He called a grand assembly, not in the cold formality of the throne room, but in the open air of the central courtyard where every member of the pack could see. He stood on a raised platform, Isolde by his side, his hand holding hers. He was no longer the Stone King, remote and untouchable. He was a vibrant, powerful alpha, his love for the woman beside him plain for all to see. "You have known me as a king who ruled from the shadows, burdened by a curse that sought to destroy me," he announced, his powerful voice ringing with conviction. "That curse is broken. The shadows are gone, and it was not broken by a sword or by sorcery. It was broken by her." He turned to Isolde, his gaze full of adoration. "This is Isolde, my mate, my queen, and the savior of your king. Her strength is not of the claw or the fang, but it is a strength that conquered a darkness that none of us could touch. She has shown us that compassion is not a weakness, and empathy is a power unto itself. We will honor her as our Luna, our queen." He lifted her hand to his lips, and then, before the entire pack, he gently pulled down the collar of her dress to reveal the faint, silvery marks of his claim on her neck. It was a symbol no shifter could mistake, a mating mark. The pack let out a collective, joyful howl that shook the mountains, a sound of acceptance, of celebration, of loyalty to their new queen. The human outcast had found her pack, and they had found their Luna. The union of Zephyros and Isolde sent ripples of change throughout the northern kingdom. It began with the court, which had for so long been a place of fear and rigid hierarchy. Under Isolde's gentle influence, it began to thaw. She listened to the petitioners, she showed kindness to the servants, and she championed the families who had suffered during the long, hard years of Zephyros's isolation. Zephyros, free from the constant agony that had fueled his cruelty, ruled with a new wisdom. He still possessed his unyielding strength, but it was now tempered by Isolde's compassion. He learned to listen, to delegate, to inspire loyalty, rather than command it through fear. He forged new, stronger alliances with the human kingdoms, with his queen acting as the perfect diplomat, her very existence a bridge between their two worlds. The old guard, who had once valued only brute force, began to see the world differently They saw how Isolde's soft power had saved them all. Healers who practiced gentler arts were given more respect. Strategists who valued cleverness over aggression were given a voice on the council. The definition of strength in their society began to broaden, to include more than just the physical. The kingdom was not weaker for it. It was more resilient, more whole. Their reign became known as a golden age, a time of unprecedented peace and prosperity, all born from the unlikely love between a broken alpha king and the human princess no one had wanted. 1 year later, Isolde stood on the same balcony where she had once felt like a prisoner. Now it was her home. The strong arms of her husband, her mate, wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. Zephyros was no longer the Stone King. He was simply her Zephyros, and his love was a warmth that had seeped into every corner of her life. "He's quiet today," Zephyros murmured, his hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of her stomach. Isolde smiled, placing her own hand over his. "He's listening to the heart of the kingdom," she replied softly. Their child, a son, would be born in the spring, a miracle of shifter and human blood, a symbol of the new world they had built together. Below them, the courtyard was bustling with life. Shifter children played alongside the children of human merchants who now traded freely and safely within the city. The air was filled with laughter, not fear. Adric was sparring with some of the younger guards, his movements full of a light-heartedness he had not shown in years. A magnificent black wolf with storm-gray eyes trotted into the courtyard and looked up at them. It was Zephyros's other half, his spirit made manifest, now free to run whenever it pleased. It gave a happy yip before trotting off to chase the children. "I never thought happiness was possible," Zephyros whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought my life was meant to be an agony." Isolde turned in his arms, cupping his face in her hands. She looked into the eyes that had once held so much pain and now held only a deep, abiding love for her. "We found our way out of the dark together," she said. He leaned down and kissed her, a tender, lingering kiss full of promises kept and a future bright with hope. The human princess and the wolf king had not just saved each other. They had built a new kingdom, founded not on power or fear, but on a love that had been strong enough to heal a broken crown and unite two worlds as one.